The city streets shimmered under the streetlights, a thin drizzle turning the asphalt into a glossy mirror. Malek Johnson wiped a bead of rain off his windshield, the rhythmic swipe of the wipers filling the quiet car. It had been another long night of picking up strangers, dropping them off at fancy downtown buildings, and hearing bits of conversations that made him shake his head. Malek liked the anonymity that came with being an Uber driver. No one looked at him twice. They saw the man behind the wheel, assumed his life was a struggle, and moved on. That was how he preferred it. He adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of his own reflection, a clean-shaven black man in his late 30s, his dark eyes steady and thoughtful. Another night in paradise, he muttered, checking the app for his next ride. A notification pinged. Sandra, it read, with a pickup at one of the posh hotels uptown. He sighed, already imagining the type entitled wealthy and ready to treat him like the help. But business was business, and he had signed up for this. Despite everything, driving allowed him a certain peace, a way to disconnect from his world of boardrooms and private jets, if only for a few hours. As he pulled up to the hotel, a tall woman in a designer trench coat stood under the awning, her phone glued to her ear. She barely glanced at his car before pulling the door open and sliding into the back seat. Finally, she huffed, still talking on the phone. "Yeah, I'm on my way. Can you believe how long I had to wait for this ride?" Malek didn't say a word, only offered a polite nod through the rearview mirror. He'd seen her type before, too caught up in their world to acknowledge his existence. It didn't bother him. He preferred it that way. The fewer questions, the better. Sandra barely paused her conversation to give him her destination, Oak Street, and make it quick. "I'm already late." He merged into traffic, the rain now a steady patter on the car's roof. Sandra's voice droned on in the back, talking about deals, money, and some extravagant gala she had to attend. Malek tuned it out, his thoughts wandering. He remembered the days when he used to be like that, caught up in the whirlwind of wealth and power, believing that money solved everything. It took him years to realize that all the riches in the world couldn't shield you from being seen as something you're not, especially when your skin color told a different story than your bank account. Malek's grip tightened on the wheel as Sandra's voice grew louder. "Yeah, I just got this new bag. It's custom, one of a kind. Worth more than this car, honestly." He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the shiny, high-end bag she was flaunting. She hadn't even looked at him when she said it. They stopped at a red light, and Sandra, still on the phone, fumbled around in her bag, pulling out a small mirror and reapplying her lipstick. Malek exhaled softly, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. People like her always assumed they were better than him. But little did she know her handbag could probably fit in his wardrobe without making a dent in his finances. The light turned green, and he pressed the gas pedal, the car gliding through the rain-slick streets. Malek thought about calling it a night after this. He'd had enough of the city's energy for one evening, but just as they neared Sandra's destination, her voice sharpened. "Wait, where's my bag?" she shrieked, her eyes wide in panic. She frantically searched the seat next to her, throwing aside her coat. "My bag, it's gone." Malek kept his eyes forward, driving calmly. "I'm sure it's in the car somewhere." "No, it's not. You must have taken it," she snapped, her voice rising with accusation. Malek's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I didn't touch your bag, ma'am. Maybe you left it at the hotel." "Don't you ma'am me. I know exactly what's going on here." Sandra's face was red now, her fingers furiously typing on her phone. "I'm calling the police. You're not going anywhere until I get my bag back." Malek felt the pit in his stomach drop. This was not the first time he'd been accused of something he didn't do. But in this moment, it didn't matter what his real status was. He was just another black man behind the wheel of a car, being accused of theft. The sirens of an approaching police car pierced through the night, flashing lights reflecting off the wet streets as Malek pulled over to the side. His night had just taken a turn for the worse. The red and blue lights flashed through the rain, casting streaks of color onto the pavement. Malek pulled over, the weight of the situation settling over him like the heavy clouds above. He had been here before too many times, really. Being questioned for something he didn't do, being suspected just because of how he looked. He turned off the ignition, took a deep breath, and waited. Sandra, still in the back seat, was on the phone, frantically telling whoever was on the other end about how her bag had disappeared, how the driver had stolen it, and how she was in danger. Her voice was shrill, filled with an air of superiority, as if she had already decided Malek's fate. Within moments, two officers approached the car, their flashlights slicing through the mist. Malek rolled down his window slowly, his hands visible on the wheel. He had learned to make every movement deliberate, every gesture calm, even if inside, frustration was boiling. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," one of the officers said, his voice flat, professional. Malek glanced in the rearview mirror. Sandra's smug face gleamed back at him. She had no doubt that the police would be on her side. He had seen this play out before, the entitled white woman crying theft, and the black man paying the price for her mistake. Still, he complied. Arguing would only make things worse. He stepped out of the car slowly, hands still in clear view. The rain picked up, drenching him as he stood by the side of the road. "What's going on?" Malik asked, keeping his voice steady. The second officer, a younger man, looked at Sandra, who had rolled down her window just enough to make herself heard. "He took my bag," she exclaimed. "It was right next to me, and now it's gone. I know he took it." The officer looked back at Malik. "Do you have the bag?" "No, I don't," Malik replied calmly, though his jaw tightened. "She must have left it at the hotel." "Are you accusing me of lying?" Sandra shouted from the back seat, her voice dripping with indignation. "I had it when I got in the car. It's worth more than this entire ride. He knows that, and now it's gone." Malik closed his eyes for a second, willing himself not to react. "I didn't take anything. I've been driving the whole time. She didn't have that bag when she got in." The younger officer stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "We're going to need to check the vehicle, just to be sure." "Go ahead," Malik said, stepping back. He knew they wouldn't find anything. But he also knew that, to them, his word meant nothing compared to Sandra's. The officers searched the car, shining their flashlights under the seats, in the back, and even in the trunk. Malik stood in the rain, his soaked jacket clinging to his body. He could feel the eyes of bystanders on him, people walking by with umbrellas, some stopping to record the scene on their phones. Another black man being pulled over, accused and publicly humiliated. He heard the murmurs, felt the judgment. The whispers came in waves, small but cutting, the kind he'd been dealing with his entire life. "Looks like he's in trouble. Why do they always do stuff like this?" You'd think he'd know better. None of them knew him. None of them knew that he owned the building across the street, or that he could buy and sell half of the city if he wanted to. To them, he was just another suspect, someone who fit the narrative of guilt without even trying. One of the officers turned back to Sandra. "Mom, we didn't find anything. Are you sure you had the bag with you?" Sandra's face twisted in disbelief. "Of course I had it. He must have hidden it or thrown it out the window." The older officer, who had remained quiet during the search, looked at Malik. "You mind explaining what happened here?" Malik met his eyes, his voice even but tired. "She got in the car without the bag. I drove her here, she realized it was missing, and now I'm being accused of stealing something I didn't touch." The officer nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. Malik could see that he wasn't sure. He could tell this cop wasn't like the others, the ones who jumped to conclusions. Still, the reality was the same in the eyes of the law. He was already guilty. Sandra stepped out of the car, shaking with rage. "I don't care what you say. He took it. I want him arrested." Malik felt a chill run down his spine. He had been careful, polite, and calm, but none of it mattered. He was at the mercy of a system that had never been designed to protect him. The officer turned to Malik again. "We're going to have to take you in, at least until we figure out what's going on. It's just procedure." Malik's heart sank. Procedure. That word had ruined lives. Procedure had broken men like him, but he didn't fight it. Fighting only made things worse. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists as the officers escorted him to the back of the squad car. Sandra stood off to the side, arms crossed, satisfied with the way things were unfolding. As Malik sat in the back of the police car, drenched and defeated, he looked out the window at the city that he knew so well. He had built businesses here, hired people, given back to the community, and yet none of it mattered. Not in this moment. He was just another black man in cuffs. The squad car's interior was cold and sterile, a harsh contrast to the warmth of Malik's car. His hands, now cuffed, rested in his lap as he stared out the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, though he had done nothing wrong. He'd been in situations like this before, but this time felt different. He was tired. Tired of being accused, tired of being seen as a suspect first and a human second. The younger officer, sitting in the driver's seat, glanced back at Malik through the mesh divider. "Look, man, just cooperate, and this will go easier for you." Malik bit back the retort that was on the tip of his tongue. Cooperate. How could he cooperate any more than he already had? He'd done everything by the book, stayed calm, but still ended up in the back of a police car. The radio crackled to life, dispatch informing the officers that Sandra was filing an official complaint. Malik's heart sank further. He knew how these things went. It didn't matter if there was no evidence. In cases like these, the word of a wealthy white woman held more weight than his, even though he could buy and sell every designer bag she owned without blinking. But that wasn't who Malik was. He had chosen to leave that life behind, or at least step away from it for a while. Driving Uber had been a way to reconnect with the world, to experience life outside of boardrooms and luxury. But now, it seemed, his experiment was crashing down around him. The car pulled up to the precinct, the rain still falling in sheets. Malik was led inside, his wrists sore from the cuffs. The fluorescent lights inside the station were harsh, adding to the sense of humiliation that gnawed at him. Sandra's voice echoed in his ears, her sharp, entitled tone calling him a thief, a criminal, simply because she couldn't fathom the possibility that her missing bag wasn't his fault. As he was booked and fingerprinted, Malik felt the familiar sting of injustice. He had seen the system chew up men like him, men who didn't have the resources to fight back, men who ended up behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. It was different for Malik. He had the money, the power, and the influence to get out of this mess. But that wasn't the point. The point was, none of that should matter. And yet, here he was. The holding cell was cold, the metal bench digging into his back as he sat down. The few other men inside were quiet, keeping to themselves. Malik leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the reality of the situation. He thought back to the life he had left behind, to the days when he had been the face of a tech empire. He had built it from the ground up, defying the odds in an industry that was often hostile to people who looked like him. He had been the only black man in many rooms, and he had felt the weight of that every day. But he had thrived, grown his company beyond anyone's expectations. Yet, even with all his success, this was where he found himself. Accused, arrested, and treated like a criminal for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could buy this police station if he wanted to. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet outside the cell. Malik's thoughts turned to what would come next. He could already see the headlines: Uber driver, accused of theft, another black man arrested. The media would eat this up. They always did. And no matter how innocent he was, the damage would be done. He hadn't told anyone about his foray into Uber driving, not his family, not his colleagues, not even his closest friends. It was his secret, a way to feel grounded in a world that often felt too high up. But now, that secret was about to explode into the public eye in the worst possible way. His phone, confiscated at the station, would be blowing up with calls and messages by now. His assistant would be panicking, and his board of directors would be wondering what in the world was happening. They didn't know that the man they saw in expensive suits and private jets also drove strangers around in a modest sedan on rainy nights. They wouldn't understand why he did it. As Malik sat in the cold cell, a deep sense of frustration and exhaustion washed over him. He had worked so hard to escape the expectations placed on him, to build something on his own terms. But in this moment, it didn't seem to matter. His wealth, his status, it couldn't protect him from this. A guard finally approached the cell, unlocking the door with a loud clang. "You've got a visitor." Malik looked up, surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. The guard led him down the dimly lit corridor to a small room, where a familiar face waited. James, one of Malik's closest friends and his personal lawyer, sat at the table, his expression a mix of concern and barely contained anger. James was sharp, well-dressed, and never one to back down from a fight, and Malik knew that if anyone could get him out of this mess, it was James. "They really screwed up this time," James said as Malik sat down across from him. "Don't worry, I'm handling it." Malik nodded, grateful but still feeling the weight of the night pressing on him. "Thanks, man. I knew this was going to blow up, but I didn't think it would happen like this." James leaned in, his voice low and intense. "They don't know who they're messing with, Malik. We're going to turn this around, and when we do, it's going to be big. Trust me." Malik looked across the table at James, his friend's confidence a small source of relief in the whirlwind of everything that had happened. He nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "I know you've got my back," Malik said, his voice low, "but this whole thing, it's not just about me, it's about all of us." James' eyes softened. He knew what Malik meant. They had both grown up seeing injustice, watching friends and family struggle with a system that never seemed to work in their favor. James had become a lawyer to fight that system, while Malik had turned to business, creating his own empire. But here they were, back at square one, battling the same prejudices that had haunted them their entire lives. "I've already got the media on this," James said, leaning back in his chair. "They're going to break the story soon. We need to control the narrative before Sandra spins this any further." Malik's jaw clenched at the mention of her name, Sandra. The woman who had decided, within minutes of meeting him, that he was a thief. She hadn't even looked him in the eyes when she made the accusation. To her, he was invisible until it was time to blame him for a mistake. "They're going to paint me as the villain," Malik said, his voice tight with frustration. "You know how these things go. A black man accused of theft, people are going to eat it up." James leaned forward, his tone firm. "Not this time, Malik. You're not just another black man accused of something. You're Malik Johnson. You built one of the most successful tech companies in the country. You've got power, influence, and we're going to use that to make sure people see the truth." Malik nodded, though the weight of it all still sat heavily on his shoulders. He knew James was right. They had the resources to fight this. But deep down, it wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about the fact that, even with everything he had accomplished, he was still vulnerable to the same old prejudices. It was exhausting, fighting the same battles over and over again. James stood up, smoothing down his suit. "I'm getting you out of here tonight. Don't worry about the police. They're going to drop the charges once we start digging into Sandra's background. She's got more skeletons in her closet than she realizes." Malik raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" James smirked, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Let's just say Sandra isn't the saint she's pretending to be. I've got a team pulling up everything on her financial records, social media posts, you name it. Once we're done, she's going to regret ever crossing you. Malak wanted to feel relieved, but something about the whole situation still gnawed at him. I don't want to destroy her, James. I just want the truth to come out. James sighed, his expression softening. I know. Malak, you're a better man than most. But this isn't just about clearing your name. This is about making sure people like Sandra can't do this to anyone else. You've got a platform now. Use it. Malak didn't respond right away. He understood what James was saying. This wasn't just about him anymore. If he could turn this situation around, he could shine a light on the everyday injustices people like him faced. He could spark a conversation, maybe even change some minds. But part of him just wanted to get through this quietly, without the fanfare, without the headlines. As they walked back toward the front of the station, Malak's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his name being called. He turned to see a small crowd of reporters gathering outside, cameras flashing through the glass doors. His stomach dropped. James glanced at him, his face set in determination. We've got this. Just stick to the facts. Let me do the talking. But before Malak could respond, the doors swung open, and they were greeted by a barrage of questions. Mr. Johnson, is it true you were arrested for theft? How do you respond to the allegations? Why were you driving for Uber in the first place? Malak kept his head down, following James' lead as they pushed through the crowd. The flashing cameras and shouting voices blurred together in a chaotic frenzy. It was surreal, being at the center of a media storm, all because of a misunderstanding rooted in something much deeper than a missing handbag. As they reached James' car, Malak paused for a moment, turning back to look at the reporters. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. He knew this was more than just a story about a wealthy man being falsely accused. This was about race, power, and the assumptions people made without a second thought. He got into the car, and James slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. As they pulled away from the police station, Malak stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of neon lights and rain. The adrenaline from the night was wearing off, leaving him feeling drained and hollow. Where do we go from here? Malak asked quietly, breaking the silence. James glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. We turn this around. We make sure the world sees who you really are, not who they think you are. Malak didn't respond. He wasn't sure who the world thought he was anymore. The billionaire tech mogul? The humble Uber driver? The criminal they had accused him of being? All he knew was that he was tired of the assumptions, tired of the expectations, tired of being seen as anything other than himself. And now, more than ever, he had the chance to change that. But the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, Malak woke to find his name all over the news. Every major outlet had picked up the story: billionaire tech founder falsely accused of theft while driving Uber. His face, looking solemn and weary, was plastered across TV screens and news websites, accompanied by headlines that told only part of the story. Malak sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, staring at his phone as notifications flooded in: emails, messages, missed calls from colleagues, family, and friends. Most of them were expressions of shock, some offering support, others simply wanting to know why a man like him had been driving for Uber in the first place. He scrolled through the messages, feeling a growing sense of unease. The media storm was far bigger than he had anticipated. His experiment, the one he had begun out of curiosity and a desire to stay connected to the everyday world, had spiraled into something he could no longer control. James had been up since dawn, working to manage the fallout. He had already lined up a press conference for later in the day, where Malak would have a chance to set the record straight. But even with James' reassurance, Malak couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just clearing his name. This was about confronting the very thing he had been trying to avoid for so long: the harsh reality of how the world saw him. As the clock ticked closer to the press conference, Malak prepared himself for what was to come. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let this moment pass without addressing the deeper issue at play. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who didn't have the resources to fight back, the ones who were falsely accused and couldn't afford a top-tier lawyer to defend them. By midday, the conference room was packed with reporters. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the podium where Malak would soon stand. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the buzz of murmured conversations filling the air. Malak stood in the wings, his heart pounding in his chest. James stood beside him, offering a firm pat on the back. "You've got this, Malak. Just speak your truth." Malak nodded, though his nerves felt like they were tied in knots. He had given speeches before countless times, in fact, but this felt different. This wasn't about business or innovation. This was about his life, his identity, and the assumptions people had made about him based on nothing more than his skin color and his circumstances. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, the room falling silent as he approached the podium. The flashing lights of cameras momentarily blinded him, but he pushed through, gripping the edges of the podium for support. For a moment, Malak just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting for him to explain himself. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "I'm here today to tell you the truth," Malik began, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion underneath. "Many of you know me as the founder of a successful tech company. Some of you know me as a businessman, an entrepreneur, or a public figure. But last night, none of that mattered." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes on him. "Last night, I was just another black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. And that's the part of this story that matters the most." Malik's voice grew stronger as he continued, the conviction in his words clear. "I was accused of theft, not because there was any evidence, but because of assumptions that people make based on how I look, based on the color of my skin. This is the reality that so many people face every single day, people who don't have the resources or the platform that I do to defend themselves." He saw the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, capturing every word, every moment. "This isn't just my story," Malik said, his voice ringing out across the room. "This is the story of countless individuals who are profiled, judged, and accused simply because of who they are. And that's what needs to change." Malik's words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He could see the impact they were having, the realization dawning on the faces of those in the room. This wasn't just a story about a billionaire and a missing handbag. This was a story about systemic injustice, about the prejudices that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. "I didn't ask for this attention," Malik continued. "I didn't want to be the center of this kind of story. But now that I am, I'm going to use this moment to speak out, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been in my position and didn't have the chance to be heard." The room was utterly silent now, the weight of Malik's words sinking in. He had the room, he had their attention, and he wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Racism and prejudice don't care about your bank account or your job title. They don't care about your accomplishments or your accomplishments. They see only what they want to see, and that's what we need to fight against. Malik's voice softened, but the intensity remained. "I'm here today, free, with the resources to clear my name. But there are so many others who aren't. So many others who are sitting in jail cells right now because of accusations that were made without proof. We have to do better. We have to be better." He stepped back from the podium, his heart racing. The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then, slowly, applause began to build. It started small, but soon it swelled into a wave of support, the sound filling the room. Malik nodded, stepping down from the stage as James met him with a smile. "You did good," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. Malik felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The media would still run with the story, people would still make their judgments, but at least now, the truth was out there. As Malik and James left the press conference, the energy from the room lingered with them. The impact of Malik's words reverberated not just in the minds of the reporters, but also in the millions who would soon be watching and reading about it. Malik could feel the weight lifting slightly from his shoulders, but he knew this was only the beginning. Back in the car, Malik leaned his head against the window, watching the city streets blur past. "I hope it was enough," he said quietly, though more to himself than to James. James glanced over, his brow furrowed. "It was more than enough. You spoke the truth. People needed to hear it." Malik nodded, though a part of him still worried. He knew the public was fickle, and the media even more so. The narrative could change in an instant, and despite his speech, there would always be those who clung to their assumptions. But for now, he had done all he could. The rest was out of his hands. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of media coverage, phone calls, and meetings. James worked tirelessly to manage the public relations side of things, while Malik tried to navigate the sudden influx of attention. It was strange, being thrust into the spotlight for something so personal, so painful, but there was also an opportunity here, an opportunity to spark real change. Sandra, on the other hand, was not faring well. James had been right, her past was riddled with scandal. As soon as her name was tied to Malik's story, reporters began digging into her life, uncovering details she had worked hard to keep hidden. Fraud allegations, questionable business dealings, even a history of similar false accusations against others. Her reputation was crumbling, and with it, any credibility she had tried to hold on to. One morning, as Malik sat in his office, his assistant knocked lightly on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice tentative. "It's Sandra." Malik raised his eyebrows in surprise. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, let alone see her in person. "Send her in," he said, standing up from his desk. Sandra entered the room slowly, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. Gone was the confident, entitled woman who had accused him of theft. In her place stood someone who looked defeated, her eyes downcast and her movements hesitant. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice soft, almost trembling. I wanted to apologize." Malik studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. He had expected this might happen eventually, though perhaps not so soon. "You don't owe me an apology," he said, his tone measured. "You owe one to everyone who's ever been in my position." Sandra swallowed, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't know," she murmured. I didn't realize. I just assumed. And that's the problem, Malik interrupted, his voice firm but calm. You assumed. You assumed because of the way I look, because of who you thought I was. You didn't bother to see me as a person. Sandra's face flushed with shame. I know. I was wrong. I realize that now. She hesitated, wringing her hands nervously. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Malak took a deep breath, weighing his next words carefully. I'm not the one you need to ask forgiveness from, he said quietly. You need to figure out how you can make this right, not just with me, but with yourself. This isn't about me anymore. It's about what you're going to do with this moment. Sandra nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She wasn't used to being held accountable, not like this. But Malik wasn't angry with her. He was disappointed, not just in her, but in the system that had taught her it was okay to act the way she did. She left the office in silence, her head bowed, and Malik watched her go, unsure if she had truly learned anything. But at least she had come. That, in itself, was a small step forward. The following week saw a shift in public conversation. Malak's story had gone viral, sparking debates about racial profiling, prejudice, and the assumptions people made about others based on appearance. Social media lit up with discussions, some supporting Malik's message, others still clinging to outdated notions of guilt by association. Malik used his platform wisely. He appeared on talk shows, gave interviews, and spoke at public events, all while maintaining the same calm, collected demeanor that had carried him through his ordeal. He knew this was bigger than him now. He had become a symbol of something larger, an opportunity to challenge the status quo, to push for real change. But amid all the noise, Malik found peace in returning to his life. He resumed his work at the tech company, though he no longer drove for Uber. That chapter of his life had come to a close, but it had taught him more than he could have imagined. It had reminded him that no matter how far you rise, there are still forces in the world that will try to pull you down, and while wealth and success could shield him from some things, they couldn't shield him from everything. One evening, as Malik stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city, he reflected on how much had changed. The city was the same, busy, chaotic, alive with energy, but he had changed. He had always known the world could be harsh, but now, more than ever, he understood the responsibility that came with his position. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. James called later that night, his voice full of excitement. Malik, you've got to see this, he said. Your story, it's made a difference. People are waking up. Malik smiled, his heart full. It wasn't about vindication or proving anyone wrong. It was about the impact, about shifting the narrative, even if only a little. As the city lights flickered below, Malik felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight was far from over, but he knew he was on the right path. And now, more than ever, he was ready to keep pushing forward, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved to be seen for who they really were.